Go mop the floors before the shareholders arrive. The words cracked across the marble lobby so sharply that even the rolling suitcase near the front desk stopped moving. Several employees froze mid-step. A receptionist behind the curved white counter slowly lowered her headset while two interns near the elevators exchanged nervous glances without saying a word. Grant Whitmore stood in the center of the lobby with one hand tucked into the pocket of his tailored navy suit, his expression twisted with the casual irritation of a man used to being obeyed instantly. Across from him, Elijah Brooks remained perfectly still beside a yellow maintenance cart, one hand resting lightly on the handle. The faint scent of industrial cleaner lingered in the chilled morning air while sunlight spilled through the 40-foot glass windows overlooking downtown Charlotte. Elijah's dark work jacket carried traces of dust near the sleeves, and a black maintenance badge hung from his chest, partially hidden beneath the fold of the fabric. Grant gave him another dismissive look, this time slower, colder. You people always find a way to stand around when there's actual work to do. The sentence landed heavily in the silence. One of the younger employees quietly looked down at the floor. Another pretended to check messages on his phone. Nobody stepped in. Nobody corrected him. Elijah simply studied Grant for a moment, calm and unreadable, his deep brown eyes reflecting the pale morning light pouring through the lobby windows. Then he nodded once. The floors are already clean, he said quietly. Grant let out a humorless laugh. Then clean them again. This building needs to look professional today. The giant digital wall behind them flashed the company logo in silver and blue while crews upstairs rushed to prepare for the annual shareholder conference. Security guards adjusted velvet ropes near the executive elevators. Catering staff wheeled trays of pastries through the hallways. The entire 32-story headquarters hummed with the nervous energy of money, status, and reputation. But Elijah didn't move toward the mop bucket. Instead, he glanced briefly toward the ceiling above the reception area where a faint clicking sound echoed from inside the ventilation system. Subtle. Almost invisible. Most people would have ignored it. He didn't. Grant noticed the glance and frowned. Did you not hear me? Elijah finally looked back at him. His voice stayed level. I heard you, Mr. Whitmore. The use of his name seemed to throw Grant off for half a second. Just enough for irritation to sharpen into suspicion. And how exactly do you know my name? Elijah answered without hesitation. Your photo's on the leadership wall upstairs. A few employees nearby hid uncomfortable expressions. Grant straightened his tie and stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly though everyone could still hear him. Then maybe you should remember your place when you speak to executives. For the first time, something shifted in the room. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a feeling. Like the air pressure before a storm. Elijah's eyes drifted across the massive lobby, over the polished marble floors, the glowing reception desk, the towering steel columns disappearing into the ceiling. Then he looked back at Grant and gave a small nod that somehow felt heavier than an argument. I always remember my place, he said. And for reasons nobody around them could explain yet, those 6 words made the entire lobby feel suddenly colder. The tension in the lobby lingered long after Grant Whitmore disappeared into the executive elevators. Conversations resumed slowly, carefully, like people testing thin ice. Elijah Brooks pushed the maintenance cart toward the east corridor without hurry, the rubber wheels gliding softly across the polished marble floor. Above him, recessed ceiling lights cast long silver reflections across the hallway walls while distant voices echoed from conference rooms being prepared for the shareholder event. He passed a pair of janitors setting up caution signs near the cafeteria entrance. One of them, an older Puerto Rican man named Luis, straightened immediately when he saw Elijah approaching. Morning, Mr. Brooks, he said quietly. Elijah nodded back with the same calm politeness he gave everyone in the building, whether they wore a security uniform or a $6,000 suit. How is your daughter's asthma? Elijah asked. Luis blinked in surprise before smiling faintly. Better this week. Doctor changed the medication. Good, Elijah replied. Charlotte weather can be rough this time of year. Then he continued walking. The younger janitor watched him disappear down the corridor before turning back to Luis. Who is that guy? He whispered. Luis lowered his voice immediately. I do not know exactly. But everybody at the service level respects him. Upstairs, sunlight spilled through the glass ceiling of the atrium as Elijah stepped into a mechanical access hallway hidden behind a pair of steel doors marked authorized personnel only. The air smelled faintly of machine oil and cool freon. Somewhere deeper inside the building, a ventilation motor rattled unevenly with a metallic clicking sound. Elijah crouched beside an open maintenance panel and removed a compact flashlight from his jacket pocket. Within seconds he identified the issue. A loose fan coupling. Minor. But if it failed during the shareholder presentation, the entire executive conference floor could lose climate control. He rolled up the sleeve of his dark jacket and began tightening the assembly with practiced precision while fluorescent lights hummed overhead. 20 minutes later the clicking vanished completely. Silence settled through the ventilation shaft. Elijah wiped his hands with a cloth and stood slowly. As he exited the corridor, a young receptionist named Claire hurried toward him holding a digital tablet against her chest. Excuse me, she said nervously. The presentation screens on level 30 are flickering again. Elijah looked at the elevator display for a moment before nodding once. I will take a look. Claire hesitated before speaking again. Can I ask you something? Elijah waited patiently. How do you know so much about everything in this building? A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. Because buildings talk, he said softly. Claire frowned slightly. Talk. Elijah glanced upward toward the faint vibration moving through the ceiling beams. Every sound means something if you pay attention long enough. Before she could respond, the executive elevator doors opened at the end of the hallway. Grant Whitmore stepped out surrounded by two department heads carrying folders and coffee cups. The moment his eyes landed on Elijah again, annoyance darkened his expression. He stopped walking entirely. Why is he still wandering around executive floors? Grant asked sharply. Claire stiffened immediately. One of the department heads looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Elijah met Grant's stare calmly while the elevator doors slid shut behind them with a soft metallic hiss. And somehow, despite the polished hallways, the expensive suits, and the $1 million conference upstairs, Grant suddenly felt like the least important man standing there. Grant Whitmore held the conference room door open with the stiff impatience of a man who believed every second around executives increased his value. The executive lounge on the 31st floor glowed beneath warm recessed lighting while floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Charlotte skyline stretching miles into the hazy Carolina distance. Inside, polished walnut tables reflected crystal water glasses and silver serving trays prepared for the shareholder meeting beginning in less than 90 minutes. A faint jazz piano instrumental drifted through hidden ceiling speakers while department heads reviewed reports beside digital screens displaying market projections in pale blue charts. Grant removed his suit jacket and tossed it carelessly over the back of a leather chair before loosening his tie half an inch. This company spent $30 million redesigning the headquarters, he said while pouring sparkling water into a glass. The last thing investors need is seeing maintenance workers wandering executive floors like they own the place. Several managers around the table gave small laughs of agreement. Melissa Conrad from Human Resources glanced down at her tablet instead of responding. Another executive leaned back carefully in his chair. I heard the shareholder group from Dallas already arrived downstairs, he said. Grant smirked faintly. Exactly my point. Image matters. He took a sip of water before continuing. People walk into a building and decide within 10 seconds whether leadership has control. You cannot build confidence around men pushing mop buckets. Near the far wall, a young analyst shifted uncomfortably while organizing presentation folders. Grant noticed and raised an eyebrow. Something funny, Daniel? The analyst hesitated. No, sir. It is just. He paused carefully. Some employees downstairs seem to know that guy. Grant rolled his eyes immediately. Of course they do. Buildings are full of maintenance staff who think being friendly makes them important. Another manager laughed louder this time. Maybe he used to work security. Grant shook his head. No. Security understands hierarchy. He walked toward the windows overlooking downtown traffic 31 floors below. Tiny streams of morning sunlight reflected off passing cars while helicopters drifted slowly above the financial district in the distance. Grant folded his arms confidently. There is a reason executives dress differently. Speak differently. Carry themselves differently. Leadership has to look expensive. Melissa finally looked up from her tablet. You do realize some of the wealthiest people in tech wear hoodies and sneakers now. Grant gave a dismissive wave without turning around. Those are exceptions. Most people at the top understand presentation. He glanced toward the hallway outside the conference room where employees hurried past carrying cables, coffee trays, and binders. People like him should stay invisible. That is how companies run smoothly. Silence followed the sentence for a moment longer than expected. Not agreement. Something else. Unease. Then one of the department heads cleared his throat softly. What if he is from corporate headquarters? Grant laughed under his breath before turning fully back toward the room. Headquarters does not dress like janitors. The room chuckled again, though weaker this time. At that exact moment, the massive digital screen mounted along the conference room wall flickered once. Then again. The financial charts vanished completely. A sharp electronic hum echoed through the speakers before the entire system went black. Every light connected to the presentation network dimmed at once. Grant stared at the dead screen in disbelief while nervous murmurs spread across the room. Outside the glass walls of the executive lounge, employees stopped walking. Somewhere down the hallway, an alarm chirped once before falling silent. Grant set his water glass down harder than intended. Tell IT to fix this immediately, he snapped. But as the room darkened beneath the fading glow of emergency backup lights, nobody moved fast enough. The executive floor shifted from polished confidence to quiet panic in less than 30 seconds. Emergency backup lights cast a dim amber glow across the conference room while frozen presentation screens reflected anxious faces in dull black mirrors. Grant Whitmore grabbed his phone immediately and stabbed at the screen with visible frustration. Why is nobody answering IT? He demanded. One of the department heads tried reconnecting the wireless system while another repeatedly pressed the wall control panel beside the conference display. Nothing responded. Outside the conference room, nervous movement spread through the hallway. Assistants hurried between offices carrying cables and tablets while security guards whispered into earpieces near the elevator banks. The annual shareholder meeting was less than an hour away, and half the executive floor had just gone dark. Melissa Conrad stepped toward the glass wall overlooking the corridor. The investors are already checking in downstairs, she said quietly. Grant exhaled sharply through his nose. Unbelievable. Then, from somewhere beyond the hallway doors, came the soft rolling sound of maintenance cart wheels against polished marble. Slow. Steady. Unhurried. Several employees turned instinctively. Elijah Brooks appeared at the far end of the corridor beneath the muted emergency lights, his dark maintenance jacket hanging neatly against his shoulders while the silver service elevator closed behind him with a low metallic hum. Grant looked immediately irritated again. Not now, he muttered under his breath. Elijah approached the conference room entrance calmly, his eyes lifting toward the dead screens inside. Power routing failure? He asked. One of the analysts answered before Grant could stop him. We think the presentation network crashed. Elijah stepped closer to the wall panel beside the conference room doors and listened quietly for a moment. Not to the people. To the building itself. Somewhere behind the walls, electrical relays clicked unevenly like faint dominoes falling out of rhythm. Elijah glanced once toward the ceiling. Then toward the floor beneath the executive server cabinet near the corner office entrance. "It is not the presentation software," he said calmly. Grant crossed his arms. "And you know this because you mop floors?" Nobody laughed this time. Elijah ignored the remark completely. He crouched beside the cabinet and pressed 2 fingers lightly against the metal vent beneath it. Warm air rushed unevenly through the opening. "The cooling system failed on this server line 10 minutes ago," he said. "The backup relay shut the network down before the processors overheated." One of the department heads blinked. "How could you possibly know that?" Elijah stood again without changing expression. "Because the relay is still cycling." Almost immediately, a faint clicking echoed again from inside the wall. The room fell silent. Grant's jaw tightened slightly. Elijah loosened the cuff of his sleeve and opened the service cabinet beside the conference room entrance. Inside, rows of wiring pulsed beneath tiny blinking indicator lights. He examined the system for less than 20 seconds before locating a failed cooling bypass switch near the lower relay panel. "Who installed this extension?" he asked quietly. Nobody answered. Elijah shook his head faintly. It was overloaded. He reset the relay manually, tightened a loose cable connection, then reached higher into the panel and adjusted a small silver control lever hidden behind the wiring harness. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then the building lights flickered once. The massive presentation screens along the conference room walls suddenly roared back to life in brilliant color. Financial charts reappeared instantly while the air conditioning vents above the ceiling resumed their steady hum. Across the executive floor, employees stopped moving. The entire conference room stared at Elijah in complete silence. Grant looked from the restored screens to Elijah's calm expression, confusion slowly hardening beneath his forced composure. Elijah closed the cabinet door gently and smoothed the sleeve of his dark maintenance jacket. "The system should hold now," he said softly. Then he looked directly at Grant. "Everyone has a place, Mr. Whitmore." For one brief moment, nobody in the executive conference room spoke. The restored screens cast cold blue light across polished walnut tables while the steady hum of returning air conditioning drifted softly through the vents overhead. Employees standing in the hallway stared through the glass walls toward Elijah Brooks with expressions that had shifted from annoyance to uncertainty. Even the analysts near the presentation controls had stopped pretending to work. Grant Whitmore felt it immediately. The room was no longer looking at him the same way. That realization hit harder than the technical failure itself. He straightened his posture slowly and forced a tight smile that never reached his eyes. "Well," he said sharply, adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit jacket, "at least maintenance managed to do its job for once." A few uneasy chuckles scattered weakly around the room before disappearing completely. Elijah remained calm beside the open service panel, one hand resting lightly against the metal cabinet door. He did not respond. That silence irritated Grant even more. There was something about the man's composure that felt disrespectful without ever becoming openly confrontational. Grant stepped closer across the conference room floor, expensive Italian shoes clicking against marble with controlled precision. "You fixed a wiring issue," he continued. "That does not suddenly make you part of executive operations." Melissa Conrad lowered her eyes toward the table. Daniel, the young analyst near the digital controls, shifted uncomfortably beside the projector console. Elijah gently closed the service cabinet and turned toward Grant without any visible emotion crossing his face. "I never said I was," he replied quietly. The answer should have ended the moment. Instead, it deepened the tension hanging over the room like invisible smoke. Grant crossed his arms. "Then maybe stop standing around like you belong here." Silence followed again. Outside the glass conference walls, assistants slowed their pace just enough to listen without appearing obvious. The shareholder event was approaching fast, yet the entire executive floor now seemed trapped inside this strange collision between authority and restraint. Elijah glanced once toward the large windows overlooking downtown Charlotte where sunlight reflected brightly off distant skyscrapers beneath the pale Carolina sky. Then he looked back at Grant. "The network system should be monitored for another 30 minutes, he said calmly. "The backup relay may cycle again under heavy load." Grant gave a cold laugh under his breath. "I think the executives can survive without technical advice from a janitor." The word landed harder this time. Not because of volume. Because of intent. Several people in the room visibly looked away. Elijah did not. He simply reached into the breast pocket of his dark maintenance jacket and removed a folded cleaning cloth stained faintly with machine dust. Slow movements. Controlled movements. The kind that somehow made Grant's growing agitation look louder by comparison. Grant suddenly pointed toward the hallway outside the conference room. "You know what? Go back downstairs." His voice sharpened enough to freeze movement outside the glass walls again. "The shareholders will be arriving any minute, and I do not want employees feeling uncomfortable because somebody from maintenance keeps wandering executive areas pretending to be important." Daniel opened his mouth slightly like he wanted to say something, then stopped himself immediately. Elijah folded the cloth carefully between his hands before slipping it back into his pocket. "I was asked to check the system," he said softly. "And it is checked now," Grant snapped. "So you can leave." The room stayed painfully still. Somewhere far below the executive floor, a faint elevator bell echoed upward through the building. Elijah studied Grant for one long second beneath the cold glow of the restored presentation screens. Then he nodded once, calm as ever. No anger. No embarrassment. No argument. Just dignity standing perfectly upright in the middle of a room determined to look down on it. And somehow, that quiet restraint made Grant feel strangely smaller with every passing second. The executive floor slowly returned to motion after Elijah Brooks walked away from the conference room, but the energy had changed. Conversations became quieter. Forced laughter disappeared. Even the clicking of expensive dress shoes across the marble hallway sounded restrained now, as though the building itself had absorbed the tension hanging in the air. Elijah pushed the maintenance cart toward the west corridor without rushing, the polished wheels rolling softly beneath the pale afternoon light spilling through the glass walls. Far below, Charlotte traffic crawled through the streets like tiny streams of silver beneath the warm Carolina sun. The shareholder event would begin in less than 40 minutes. Yet for the first time all morning, Elijah moved without speaking to anyone. He stopped near a quiet corner of the executive floor where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline stretching endlessly into the distance. Sunlight reflected across the glass, laying long golden lines across the dark sleeves of his maintenance jacket. For a moment he simply stood there with one hand resting against the handle of the cart, calm and unreadable while helicopters drifted slowly beyond the towers outside. The building hummed softly around him. Air vents. Elevator cables. Distant printers. The quiet mechanical heartbeat of a corporation trying desperately to appear perfect. Behind him, the sound of cautious footsteps approached slowly. "Mr. Brooks?" Elijah turned slightly. It was Denise Carter, one of the senior cleaning staff members assigned to executive floors. She carried a small paper coffee cup in one hand, steam rising gently through the cool air-conditioned hallway. Her silver-gray uniform reflected the fading afternoon sunlight while concern rested quietly across her face. "You have been walking these halls since 6 this morning," she said softly. "You should probably drink something." Elijah accepted the coffee with a small nod. "Thank you, Denise." She glanced briefly toward the conference room at the far end of the hallway where silhouettes still moved behind the glass walls. "People saw what happened in there," she murmured carefully. Elijah looked down at the coffee cup warming his hands. "Buildings see everything eventually," he replied. Denise studied him for a second longer before smiling faintly. "Still. Some people forget manners when they think they have power. Elijah gave a quiet exhale that almost resembled amusement. Almost. Then silence settled again between them while sunlight deepened into soft amber against the windows surrounding the executive floor. A few feet away, the American flag near the shareholder auditorium shifted gently beneath the air conditioning vent. Somewhere below them, elevator bells chimed faintly through the building. Denise adjusted the strap of her cleaning bag before lowering her voice slightly. "You know, my grandson started working in shipping last year because of your scholarship program." Elijah's eyes lifted toward her slowly. Denise smiled with quiet pride. "First person in our family going to college next fall." Elijah nodded once, deeply sincere. "That is good to hear." She hesitated before adding softly, "He says the company changed his life." Elijah stared through the windows again, watching sunlight flicker across the distant rooftops downtown. "People change companies," he said quietly. "Not the other way around." Behind them, the executive hallway doors suddenly opened. Grant Whitmore stepped into the corridor while reviewing notes on his tablet, irritation still sharp across his face. He barely looked up at first. Then he heard Denise's voice clearly drift through the quiet hallway. "You okay, Mr. Brooks?" Grant stopped walking instantly. The words seemed to hit him before the meaning fully did. His eyes lifted slowly toward Elijah standing beside the windows, coffee cup in hand beneath the golden afternoon light. Something shifted behind Grant's expression. Tiny. Unsteady. Like the first crack forming inside glass. And for the first time that entire day, Grant Whitmore looked uncertain. The uncertainty on Grant Whitmore's face disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived, replaced by the rigid confidence of a man refusing to acknowledge a feeling he could not explain. He tightened his grip on the tablet in his hand and continued walking down the executive hallway without another word. But his pace had changed. Slower now. Less certain. Behind him, Denise Carter quietly returned to her cleaning duties while Elijah Brooks remained standing beside the glass windows overlooking Charlotte. Afternoon sunlight stretched long across the marble floor, casting reflections that shimmered softly beneath the polished executive corridor. Then the overhead speaker system chimed once throughout the building. "Attention all executive staff and shareholders. The annual leadership presentation will begin in 15 minutes inside the Horizon Auditorium." Immediately the atmosphere shifted again. Assistants moved quickly through hallways carrying tablets and portfolios. Security personnel adjusted velvet barriers near the auditorium entrance while shareholders in tailored suits stepped off private elevators with polished smiles and expensive watches catching the light. The top floor of the building transformed into a theater of wealth and influence. Grant entered the Horizon Auditorium with renewed confidence, greeting investors with smooth handshakes and carefully rehearsed charm. The massive room glowed beneath warm chandelier lighting while giant digital screens curved around the stage displaying the company's silver logo against a dark blue background. Rows of leather seats filled steadily with board members, regional directors, and shareholders from across the country. Quiet conversation floated through the auditorium like static beneath the soft instrumental music playing overhead. Grant adjusted the microphone at center stage while reviewing his opening notes. Everything finally appeared under control again. At least on the surface. Near the rear entrance, Daniel leaned toward Melissa Conrad and lowered his voice carefully. "Did you ever figure out who Elijah Brooks actually is?" Melissa shook her head slightly. "No. But I checked internal records." Daniel waited. "There are no employee files under that name." Before he could respond, the lights dimmed slowly throughout the auditorium. Conversation softened instantly. A low cinematic tone rolled through the speakers as the giant screens behind the stage shifted to a sleek black background displaying silver lettering. Grant smiled confidently toward the audience and stepped closer to the microphone. "Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Whitmore Regional Operations, welcome to this year's Shareholder Leadership Conference." Polite applause spread through the room. Grant continued smoothly, discussing quarterly growth projections and expansion targets while financial charts illuminated the massive screens behind him. Everything felt rehearsed. Controlled. Safe. Then the auditorium doors opened quietly near the back of the room. Several people turned instinctively. Elijah Brooks entered alone. Still wearing the dark maintenance jacket. Still carrying the same calm expression. The room reacted subtly at first. A few confused glances. A whisper near the investor section. Grant noticed him immediately and his jaw tightened beneath the stage lights. He stepped away from the microphone slightly. "Excuse me," he said sharply into the silence. "This area is restricted during executive presentation." Elijah stopped near the center aisle beneath the soft glow of the auditorium lights. Hundreds of eyes shifted between the two men. Grant forced a thin smile for the audience. "Security." Two guards near the entrance hesitated instead of moving. That hesitation lasted only 2 seconds. But it was enough. Then the giant screens behind Grant suddenly went black again. The room murmured nervously. Grant turned sharply toward the display wall just as new silver lettering slowly appeared across every screen in the auditorium at once. Executive Leadership Presentation. Beneath it, another line faded into view. CEO and Founder, Elijah Brooks. The entire auditorium went dead silent. Grant stared at the screens without blinking. His face lost color so quickly it almost looked unreal beneath the stage lighting. Slowly, painfully slowly, he turned back toward the center aisle where Elijah stood calmly beneath the glow of the chandelier lights. No anger. No triumph. Just quiet certainty. Then Elijah walked forward through the silence while hundreds of executives and shareholders watched in complete disbelief. Grant's hands loosened from the podium, one trembling finger at a time. And for the first time that day, the most powerful man in the room looked completely powerless. Silence settled across the Horizon auditorium with a weight so heavy it almost seemed physical. Hundreds of shareholders remained frozen in their seats beneath the glow of the chandeliers while the giant screens behind the stage continued displaying the same silver lettering over a dark background. CEO and Founder, Elijah Brooks. Nobody whispered now. Nobody checked phones. Even the faint rustling of presentation papers had stopped completely. Elijah Brooks walked calmly down the center aisle between rows of leather seats, his dark maintenance jacket still carrying traces of dust from the service corridors downstairs. Each step echoed softly through the auditorium while stunned executives watched him pass with widening eyes. Grant Whitmore remained at the podium under the stage lights, one hand gripping the edge hard enough for his knuckles to pale beneath his skin. The confidence that had filled his voice all morning was gone now. Stripped away piece by piece beneath the crushing reality spreading through the room. Elijah reached the front of the auditorium and stepped onto the stage without hurry. He paused beside Grant for one brief moment before turning calmly toward the audience. The massive windows lining the upper walls reflected the fading afternoon sunlight across the polished floor while cameras prepared for the shareholder live stream remained motionless on their tripods. Nobody operating them seemed to know what to do. Grant swallowed hard. "Mr. Brooks. His voice cracked slightly before fading altogether. Elijah looked at him quietly. Not with anger. Not even disappointment. Somehow that made it worse. Grant lowered his eyes toward the stage floor. "I did not know," he said carefully, struggling to steady his breathing. "If I had known who you were." Elijah interrupted softly. "That is the problem." The room stayed completely still. Elijah stepped toward the podium and rested one hand lightly against the polished wood surface where Grant had stood speaking only minutes earlier. "If respect depends on knowing someone's title," he continued calmly, "then it is not respect at all." Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Melissa Conrad stared downward at her folded hands while Daniel sat motionless near the back row, unable to look away from the stage. Grant's face tightened with visible shame. I made a mistake, he admitted quietly. Elijah studied him for a long moment beneath the warm stage lights. No, he said softly. You revealed a habit. The words landed harder than shouting ever could have. Grant blinked slowly, unable to respond. Around the auditorium, executives who had laughed earlier now sat in absolute silence, trapped inside the memory of every dismissive glance and careless comment from that morning. Elijah finally turned away from Grant and faced the audience directly. His voice remained calm and steady, carrying naturally through the quiet auditorium without effort. 6 years ago, when this company was failing, the people who kept these buildings running stayed anyway. Security staff worked double shifts. Cleaning crews slept in break rooms during winter storms. Maintenance workers repaired flooded systems overnight so employees could still come to work in the morning. His eyes moved slowly across the audience. Most companies celebrate executives during shareholder meetings. I wanted to see whether this company still remembered the people underneath the marble floors and glass walls. Somewhere near the back row, Denise Carter quietly wiped moisture from the corner of one eye. Elijah continued softly. Power does not reveal character. It reveals habits. Grant finally lifted his eyes again, his expression hollow beneath the bright stage lights. I am sorry, Mr. Brooks. The apology sounded smaller than the room around it. Elijah nodded once. I believe you are. Then he reached down calmly, removed the maintenance badge from his jacket, and placed it gently on the podium beside Grant's trembling hand. No dramatic speech followed. No threats. No public humiliation. Only silence. The kind of silence that forces people to hear themselves clearly for the first time. The executive floor had gone quiet by the time the shareholders finally left the building. Evening sunlight poured through the towering glass walls in deep orange reflections that stretched across the marble floor like liquid gold. Employees moved softly through the hallways now, speaking in lowered voices as though the entire headquarters had changed shape in a single afternoon. Elijah Brooks stepped out of the auditorium alone, his dark maintenance jacket still resting neatly across his shoulders while the distant hum of elevators echoed through the building. Near the executive elevators, a paper coffee cup had tipped over beside the wall, leaving a dark stain across the polished marble. Several younger employees noticed it but hesitated, unsure whether to call housekeeping or leave it for the night crew. Elijah stopped walking the moment he saw it. Calmly, he removed the folded cleaning cloth from his pocket and crouched beside the stain beneath the warm evening light. The hallway remained silent except for the soft sound of fabric moving against marble. A young intern carrying folders slowed to a stop nearby, staring in disbelief. Sir, he said carefully, someone else can get that. Elijah glanced up briefly, his expression steady and gentle. If something needs care, he replied softly, you take care of it. The intern lowered his eyes quietly. Farther down the hallway, Grant Whitmore stood near the glass windows overlooking the Charlotte skyline. He had not spoken for several minutes. His expensive suit still looked sharp beneath the fading light, but the certainty inside him was gone now. He watched Elijah clean the floor without cameras, without applause, without anger. And somehow that simple act weighed heavier than every word spoken in the auditorium earlier that day. Elijah finished, folded the cloth neatly, and stepped toward the elevator as the last sunlight faded across the building. The doors closed slowly around him while the quiet headquarters reflected his silhouette one final time across the marble floor. And in the stillness left behind, the building no longer felt ruled by power. It felt ruled by character.